In this week's video, we're going to be going over how we painted the plasma coil on the Deathwing Terminator. We had quite a few requests for this, so it seems crazy not to make it happen. As always, if you enjoy the video, really appreciate it if you hit the like button. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you do want to support the channel further, as always, feel free to check out the members area. The paints that we use for this one are Vallejo Model Color White, Vallejo Model Color Fluorescent Magenta, AK Interactive Magenta, AK Interactive Deep Purple, AK Interactive Amethyst Blue. To start off with, we're going to be using the Vallejo Model Color White, and we're going to be going over the plasma coils. I like the Vallejo Model Color White because it really does give you a nice, bright, vibrant white. I would say to thin it down, you want a semi-transparent paint here. So break the surface tension on the paint because this white is very thick out of the pot, it's very opaque. This is my preferred white, but basically what you're doing is you're looking to place white over the plasma coil to give you a really luminous base for what we put over the top. This will probably take 2 or 3 coats. My recommendation here, although we don't always require a smooth paint job, for the plasma coils, we want a nice smooth base coat. So 2 or 3 thin coats to get a nice solid base coat is what you're after. Also, when you're doing a grimdark style paint job and you've got lots of texture in the model, it's good to have areas of smoothness to create contrast in texture across the model. So in this case, because the model is so worn and there's so much texture in the armor, that will actually make the plasma coil pop more because the plasma coil is going to be so smooth in comparison to everything else. Remember, miniature painting, number one, we want to create strong readable shapes. Secondly, what we want to do is create really great contrast. And there are lots of different types of contrast. It's not just contrast in light and dark. We can have contrast in texture, saturation, all sorts. Once you've got a nice solid base coat of the white, like you can see on screen, next up what we're going to be using is the Vallejo Model Color Fluro Magenta. Now, I'll be honest with you, I would prefer to airbrush this in hindsight. The gel medium in the Fluro Magenta makes it really awkward to work with. So I would recommend airbrushing it if you can. If not, what you want to do is build up several really thin coats of this Fluro Magenta over the white. Keep the paint nice and thin, but because of how thin this paint is and how transparent it is and how the gel behaves, this part is always going to look pretty bad. So don't panic if it looks messy, and you're going to see that as we go. But the idea is thin paint, build it up over the white, so we've got a nice vibrant magenta. Because remember, the recess of this, the source of the heat on the plasma coils, that needs to be brighter. So this is the magenta. As I said, personal recommendation, I would use an airbrush, but for the purposes of this video, we didn't want to do that. So multiple thin coats, nice and thin. It's better to do too many coats than not enough. So if your paint is too thick, it's going to end up looking very, very messy and it's going to cover too much of the white. If your paint is too thin, all that means is you're going to have to do more coats. So it's much safer to have paint that's too thin. Cover the whole of the coils. It's really good for this to flow into the recesses. It's worth noting at this point, we're not focusing on the ridges of the plasma coil. We're only focusing on the recesses of the plasma coil. We'll have time to do the ridges later on. Next up, with this idea of working with the recesses, not the ridges, we're going to try and create a gradient going towards the coldest part of the coils, so the top of the coils. What we're moving on to is AK Magenta and AK Deep Purple. So first of all, this is the AK Interactive Magenta. And what we're doing is as you get towards the top of the plasma coils, we're going to try and create a gradient from that fluorescent magenta that we've already put on up into the AK Magenta and then going further into the Deep Purple. Now, as I said, the priority here is the recesses. We can fix the coils later, or rather we will fix the coils later because we're going to end up making a mess. If you just try and do this gradient and paint between the ridges, then you're giving yourself much more work and there's just no point. So focus on creating a nice gradient my recommendation would be is to use a semi-transparent paint, build your brush strokes from the light area into the dark area. So as an example, you have magenta on your brush. You want to start closer to the hot part of the coils, like you can see on screen, and you want to push your brush stroke towards the colder part of the coils, towards the dark section, towards the top of the plasma coils. This will help give you a natural gradient. It's worth pointing out, this blend does not need to be perfect. We're going to fix the transitions later with several glazes. So rough gradient all the way from the fluorescent magenta that we started with up through to AK magenta, and then even further into the AK interactive deep purple all the way at the top. Once you've got this rough gradient, you can start to smooth it out with some glazes. So remember, a glaze consistency of paint is super, super thin, almost similar consistency to a traditional wash, but the difference is what you want to do is you want to remove the majority of that paint off of your brush. So we're getting a glaze consistency of paint for the AK interactive magenta, and we're just glazing over the whole area to soften out those transitions. So where before we had that rough transition that we created, now we're just going to smooth it out a little bit with the magenta again to make it a little bit better. After that, we're going to start picking out the ridges of the coils. So where previously we were looking at the recesses, now we're going to be going with the ridges. So this is the AK Amethyst. And what we're trying to do is we're just trying to pick out the top of the ridges. We're going with a semi-transparent paint, so it's going to take a few coats. And we're using the side of the brush. The reason why we're doing the side of the brush is it makes it a lot easier. We're getting the brush to work for us. So hopefully if we use the side of the brush, it's not going to dip into any of the recesses. And we're just trying to pick out the coils. Same again, we want a gradient from light to dark. So the closer the ridges of these coils get towards the bright spot at the bottom of the plasma coil, the brighter it's going to be. The further towards the top of the plasma coil these ridges become, the darker it's going to be. So you can notice the brush is going towards that dark area. We're starting in the light area and going into the dark area. And we're building up several layers of this AK Amethyst to basically darken them down, and we're trying to create a nice gradient. So what we have effectively is we have a gradient in the recesses of light to dark, and then we have a gradient on the ridges from light to dark, but the light to dark on the ridges are even darker. And this is where it really starts to create the illusion of this glow. And just to see, like, this is close up of what it's looking like. You can do it as like nice smooth brush strokes from side to side, or you can do it in like a stippling motion, which is what I'm doing here, where we're almost tapping the plasma coil. Either is fine. The main reason why I'm doing stippling is I like a little bit of variation in it, but it's not a huge deal because, as we say, as you glaze these things down and you smooth it out, the texture is going to vanish and you're going to end up with a really smooth result. Next up, what we need to do is we need to go back to that Vallejo model color white. As part of the process with painting this, we lose a lot of the luminosity just while we're painting because we're glazing over the top of it and we're doing some blending and we're probably going to make some mistakes. So we're going back into the brightest area, the hottest area of the plasma coil towards the bottom with the Vallejo model color white. And we're reintroducing that white into the plasma coil. Also going to, between the ridges, so the recesses of the coil itself, we're also going to paint in some of the white. And we're pushing our brushstroke from the top towards the bottom, so the deposit of the white paint you can see is being left at the bottom of the plasma coil. And the idea with this is it gives us our really, really bright value back. Now, some people like to leave it pure white. I quite like it, and I get it. It looks great on Instagram for pictures, because obviously the camera makes the white pop so much more. Believe me, there is no white that glows like that in real life. So it's up to you. If you want to work with just the white and leave it like that, then by all means go for it. For us, we're prioritizing something that looks great in person as opposed to over the photographs. So the reason why I'm saying this is what we're going to do is we're going in with the white and we're going to go back over it to make it less extreme. don't panic too much about making mistakes. As in, if you go over some of the ridges, don't panic about it. There's plenty of time to fix that because you can just go back in with like the magenta and clean it up. And believe me, everyone makes mistakes with it. You can see this is really, really bright now. It's pure white. You can use like fluorescent paints if you want. I've never felt the need to be honest. You can see I'm just going back over the ridges here because we've made mistakes. So don't panic. It's easy to clean up the ridges. It's easier to clean up the ridges than it is the recesses because you can just use that side stroke motion and neaten it all up. Once you've done this and you've got it to a point where you're happy with it and you've got the pure white, you then need to make a decision. In this case, I'm using an airbrush. You don't need to use an airbrush, but in this case, I've got the Fluro Magenta. This is the Vallejo model color Fluro Magenta, the color that we used for the original base coat. And I'm very thinly airbrushing over the top of the white and over the top of the plasma coil. If you don't have an airbrush or you don't like using an airbrush, once again, glaze it over with the brush. So you can use the airbrush, super thin paint, or you can glaze it with a brush, super thin paint, and remove the excess. But the idea with this is we're trying to, first of all, it will help once again with smoothing everything out, but it will integrate the white. It will stop the white looking like white. It will give it this nice magenta tint to it. So in my opinion, it looks far more natural and in person looks far stronger. Now, it does mean that when we take a photograph of it, it's not going to be as crazy as extreme as you might see normally in photographs. But as I said, this is for a client. We need to make sure that it looks great in person over a picture. So nice simple glaze over the top. Do it with an airbrush, do it with a paintbrush, doesn't matter, but we're just tinting that white, smoothing everything out and bringing it in line. And I think it makes a huge difference in the end. One other thing that I think is really important to talk about is how you photograph plasma coils or anything that has any kind of glow makes a huge difference. If you photograph it against the white background, it's not as potent. If you photograph it against a black background, it's going to be far, far stronger. This is something that doesn't get talked about. Depending on how you photograph something will depend on how good it looks. Black backgrounds make OSL or glowing objects much, much stronger. And that's why when you see really, really strong OSL pieces, really, really strong glowing pieces online, they are nearly always on a black background. So just bear that in mind. It doesn't matter how good the photos are. It never looks exactly like it does online. And that's it. Thanks so much for watching. It means a huge, huge amount to us. As always, if you enjoyed the video, make sure you hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and let me know what you think in the comments below. If you are interested in getting a commission done, feel free to get in touch. Or if you are looking to be a better painter or join the community, feel free to have a look at the Discord or join the members area. Cheers.